They say Sedona either calls to you or it spits you out. There's no in between. For me, it wasn't just a call. It was a siren song I couldn't ignore. My name is Leo Vance, and I've spent the better part of my life chasing ghosts, not the kind that rattled chains in dusty attics, but the ghosts of history, the echoes of strange events that defy conventional explanation. As a historian with a deep fascination for the paranormal, Sedona, Arizona was my mecca. It was a place where the veil between worlds was said to be thin, where ancient Native American legends of star people were whispered on the wind, and where New Age mystics claimed to draw energy from the very earth itself. My goal was specific: to study the town's famous energy vortexes. These were supposedly specific spots where the Earth's energy is amplified, leading to spiritual healing, heightened consciousness, and all manner of strange phenomena. The academic in me was skeptical, but the investigator was intrigued. To do it right, I knew I couldn't just be a tourist. I had to immerse myself, to live in the heart of the mystery. That's how I found the cabin. It was an old, rustic structure, tucked away in a secluded canyon miles from the tourist-heavy town center. The rental listing was sparse on details, but heavy on warnings. For the serious spiritual seeker only, it read. The property sits on what is considered to be a powerful confluence of energies. The locals I spoke to were even more direct. They called it the Whispering Cabin, and told me stories of previous tenants who had left in the middle of the night, driven away by unsettling dreams and a constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. For me, that was a ringing endorsement. As I drove my beat-up truck down the long, dusty dirt road for the first time, the sheer scale of the place was breathtaking. The red rock formations rose around me like ancient, sleeping giants, their faces carved by millennia of wind and water. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The air was still and warm, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. When I finally saw the cabin, it was perfect, small, isolated, and dwarfed by the magnificent, silent stones that surrounded it. It felt like a place that held secrets. Standing there with the key in my hand and the vast, silent wilderness around me, I felt a thrill of anticipation. I had come seeking echoes of the past, whispers of the unknown. I had no idea that soon those whispers would begin to speak directly to me. The first few days were deceptively calm. I spent my time unpacking, setting up my research equipment, audio recorders, EMF meters, temperature sensors, and exploring the immediate surroundings. The silence was absolute, a deep, ringing quiet that was a world away from the constant hum of the city. During the day, the sun baked the red earth, and the landscape seemed to vibrate with a dormant energy. But it was the nights that truly defined the character of the place. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature would drop, and the canyon would be plunged into a profound darkness, the likes of which I had rarely experienced. The sky, unobscured by city lights, was a breathtaking tapestry of stars. The strange occurrences began subtly. It started with the audio recordings. I would leave my high-sensitivity microphones running all night, and in the morning I'd listen back to hours of silence. But in between the chirping of crickets and the gentle sigh of the wind, there were anomalies. Faint, melodic whispers, too low to be deciphered, that sounded like a conversation happening in a distant room. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like soft rhythmic drumming, a deep, resonant beat that seemed to come from the very ground beneath the cabin. My equipment registered nothing out of the ordinary. No electromagnetic spikes, no sudden temperature drops. It was a phenomenon that seemed to exist just below the threshold of scientific measurement. Then came the physical sensations. I'd be sitting at my desk, poring over old maps of the area, and a sudden, inexplicable vibration would run through the floorboards as if a heavy truck were passing by on a road that didn't exist. Objects in the cabin began to move. A pen would roll off a perfectly flat table. A book, left on a chair, would be found on the floor on the other side of the room. It was classic poltergeist activity, the kind of thing I'd read about in countless case files, but experiencing it firsthand was different. It wasn't frightening, not yet. It was inquisitive. It felt less like a haunting and more like the house itself was alive, gently prodding and testing its new resident. But the most unsettling part was the growing feeling of being watched. It was a constant, low-level hum of awareness at the back of my neck. I'd be walking the perimeter of the property and would feel a sudden urge to turn around, convinced I would see someone standing among the twisted juniper trees, only to find nothing but the silent, watchful rocks. The legends called this place the Whispering Cabin, and I was beginning to understand why. The whispers weren't just on my recordings, they were starting to form in the air around me, in the rustle of the leaves, in the sound of the wind whistling through the canyon. Sedona was starting to talk to me, and I had the unnerving feeling that it had been waiting for a very, very long time. It was in the second week that the dreams began. They weren't the usual chaotic, nonsensical narratives of a tired mind. These were different. They were vivid, structured, and felt more real than my waking hours. The first dream was simple, yet profound. I was standing barefoot on the cool red earth, under a sky ablaze with more stars than I had ever seen. I looked down at my hands, and they weren't my own. They were the weathered, wrinkled hands of an old man, and they were covered in faint, glowing geometric patterns, like intricate tattoos made of starlight. I could feel the energy of the ground thrumming up through the soles of my feet, a deep, ancient pulse, like a sleeping heart. Night after night, the dreams continued, each one a fragment of a larger, incomprehensible story. I saw visions of strange, silent beings, tall and slender, their forms indistinct, almost like heat haze, walking among the red rocks. They didn't communicate with words, but with a form of pure, silent understanding that flowed directly into my mind. They showed me the canyon not as it was now, but as it was thousands of years ago. I saw ancient people, the ancestors of the local Native American tribes, gathering in sacred circles, not to worship these beings, but to commune with them, learning about the stars, the earth, and the cycles of the cosmos. The most jarring dream was one in which I was no longer an observer. I was looking through the eyes of someone else, or something else. I felt an immense, heartbreaking loneliness, the sorrow of a being who had watched civilizations rise and fall, who had been a silent guardian for millennia. I saw the earth from high above, a swirling blue marble in the silent void, and felt a deep, abiding love for it, mixed with a profound fear for its future. I would wake up with a gasp, my heart pounding, the phantom emotions of the dream still clinging to me like a shroud. The scent of ozone, a smell often associated with electrical discharges and UFO sightings, would hang faintly in the air of the cabin. I began to document everything, frantically scribbling down the details of each dream in a journal the moment I woke up. The academic in me was trying to find a rational explanation: stress, the power of suggestion, the high altitude playing tricks on my mind. But the investigator knew better. The whispers in the cabin, the moving objects, the vivid dreams, they weren't separate phenomena. They were all connected. They were different forms of communication. The vortex wasn't just a geological anomaly, it was a conduit, and something on the other side was using it to slowly, patiently make its presence known. I wasn't just studying a place, I was being studied in return. The dreams were becoming too consistent, too profound to be dismissed as mere subconscious ramblings. They felt like lessons delivered in a language beyond words. I knew there had to be a key, something to bridge the gap between my academic understanding and these profound ethereal experiences. My attention turned back to the cabin itself. It was old, built on land steeped in history, and the legends clearly stated it was on a powerful vortex. It wasn't just near the vortex, it was the vortex. One sweltering afternoon, while organizing an old, dusty bookshelf in the corner of the living room, a loose board creaked beneath my hand. Curiosity piqued. I pulled it away, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded woven cloth, lay a leather-bound journal. It looked ancient, its cover worn smooth by countless hands, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. This wasn't a modern tenant's forgotten diary. This was something far older, a true relic. The journal was meticulously kept, filled with a delicate flowing script. It wasn't in English, nor any European language I recognized, but interspersed among the elegant flowing symbols were crude drawings, stick figures gazing at the night sky, geometric patterns almost identical to the ones I'd seen in my dreams, and recurring depictions of tall, slender beings standing among the red rocks. The most striking illustrations were of what looked like luminous, saucer-shaped objects descending from the heavens. This wasn't fiction. This was someone's life work, their observations. As I carefully turned the pages, a small, smooth, obsidian-like stone fell out. It was jet black, perfectly polished, and cold to the touch, yet when I held it, I felt a faint, almost imperceptible thrumming, an echo of the vibrations I felt from the cabin floor. There was a drawing of this very stone on one of the pages, labeled with a symbol that looked like a stylized star and a human eye. The journal, I realized, belonged to one of the original settlers, or perhaps even an ancestor of the local tribes who had learned to write in a hybrid script after the arrival of Europeans. It was a bridge between worlds, a record of a secret passed down through generations. Suddenly, the whispers on my audio recordings made more sense. The rhythmic drumming I'd heard wasn't random. It was depicted in the journal as part of ancient ceremonies to call the starlights. The geometric patterns were not just decorative, they were a form of ancient communication, a language of light and shape. My dreams weren't just dreams, they were an initiation, a connection being re-established, perhaps guided by the spirit of the journal's author. I wasn't just in a cabin, I was in a living archive, and the long-dead caretaker had left me the instructions. Sedona wasn't just calling, it was revealing its history, piece by painstaking piece. And I was now irrevocably part of it. The journal became my obsession. Days blurred into nights as I painstakingly worked to decipher its contents. The archaic script was a challenge, but by cross-referencing the English notes with the recurring symbols and drawings, I began to piece together a rudimentary understanding. It wasn't a linear narrative. It was a collection of observations, rituals, and profound philosophical insights passed down through what felt like generations. The author, whose name I eventually discerned as Kaya, seemed to be a guardian, a liaison between her people and the star people. Kaya's journal described the Sedona vortexes not as mere energy points but as listening posts, places where the Earth's consciousness resonated with something beyond. The star people weren't visitors from distant planets in spaceships, not in the traditional sense. They were interdimensional beings, entities of pure energy or highly advanced consciousness that existed in a slightly different vibratory state, making them largely invisible to human eyes and instruments. They had always been here, observing, occasionally guiding, interacting with those few humans sensitive enough to perceive them. My vivid dreams, I realized, were direct communications, being filtered through the vortex and amplified by my proximity to it. The obsidian-like stone, which Kaya referred to as the listener, was a key. When I held it while focusing on a particular symbol in the journal, the stone would grow warm and emit a faint internal luminescence. More remarkably, when I brought it close to my audio recorder, the whispers I had been capturing would become clearer, almost intelligible. They weren't words as we knew them, but complex patterns of sound and light that conveyed immense amounts of information. It was a language of pure frequency and intention. Through the journal and the listener, I began to comprehend the Star People's message. They were not here to conquer or to intervene. They were custodians, protectors of a delicate cosmic balance. Their primary directive was observation, but they were deeply concerned about humanity's trajectory, our rampant destruction of our own planet, our constant conflicts, and our dangerous fascination with technologies we barely understood. They were trying to warn us, to guide us, but without directly interfering with our free will. The vortex, the cabin, the dreams, it was all an elaborate, ancient system designed to nudge humanity towards a different path. This realization was overwhelming. Everything I thought I knew about the universe, about history, about what it meant to be human was being rewritten. The hauntings were not ghosts. They were the subtle manifestations of these beings. The moving objects were their gentle nudges, the whispers were their attempts to communicate, and the dreams were their direct transmissions. I was no longer an academic studying phenomena, I was becoming a conduit, a part of a much larger, ancient conversation. The profound sense of loneliness I'd felt in my dreams was no longer just mine, it was theirs. A silent plea from beings who watched with patient sorrow as we stumbled towards an uncertain future. I knew then that my research had only just begun, and the implications stretched far beyond anything I could have imagined. My absorption in Kaya's journal and my mental communication with the Star People was so complete that at first I didn't notice the subtle shift in my surroundings. I was too deep in the ancient wisdom, too focused on understanding the language of light and stone. But the dreams became more urgent, less ethereal and more cautionary. They showed me fleeting images of dark vehicles, of men in suits watching from a distance, of electronic signals being broadcast into the canyons. The sense of being watched, which had been a constant low hum, intensified into a palpable presence. It began with small things. I noticed tire tracks on the dusty road leading to my cabin that weren't mine. They were always fresh, appearing overnight and vanishing by morning. Occasionally, I'd spot a glint of sunlight reflecting off something high on the distant red rocks, something that looked suspiciously like a camera lens. My EMF meter, which usually stayed quiet when not near the vortex, would sometimes spike erratically when I was hiking further out, pointing toward sources of sophisticated electronic interference in unexpected places. One evening as I was walking back to the cabin after observing the sunset, I saw it. Parked on a high ridge, almost perfectly camouflaged against the darkening landscape, was a dark, unmarked SUV. It was too far away to make out details, but I felt an immediate primal sense of alarm. It wasn't a tourist lost on a back road. It sat there for an hour, unmoving, before its headlights flashed briefly, and it drove away without a sound, leaving only the memory of its unsettling presence. The message from the Star People, conveyed through my dreams and the listener, became clearer. They watch. They seek to understand. They seek to control. It was the government, of course. My academic background had always kept me aware of the persistent rumors of secret projects, of clandestine agencies monitoring anomalies, but to experience it firsthand, To know that my quiet research into ancient mysteries had attracted the attention of powerful hidden forces was a chilling realization. I started searching the cabin, methodically, meticulously. It wasn't long before I found it, a tiny, sophisticated listening device, expertly hidden within the wooden frame of my living room window. It was small, no bigger than my thumbnail, and clearly professional grade. My whispering cabin wasn't just attracting ancient energies, it was a modern-day surveillance post. They had been listening to everything, my recordings, my theories, my frustrations. They probably knew about the journal. They likely even knew about the listener. The discovery of the listening device changed everything. The serene, contemplative atmosphere of the cabin was shattered, replaced by a constant thrum of paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sounded like an approaching threat. I stopped recording, stopped speaking my theories aloud, and became meticulously careful about my actions. The dreams, however, continued, becoming more pointed, showing me images of capture, of containment, of the Star People's energy being siphoned and controlled. They were not just warning me, they were showing me their fears. My connection with the Star People, mediated through the listener in the vortex, was now my most potent weapon and my greatest vulnerability. They communicated the urgency of the situation. The government, or at least a powerful faction within it, was not interested in peaceful contact or shared knowledge. They perceived the interdimensional beings as an anomaly to be exploited, or a danger to be neutralized. They wanted to understand the vortex, not to connect with it, but to control its power, to use it as a weapon, or perhaps even as a gate. Director Thorne's face, a phantom from my research into past UFO cover-ups, now swam into my mind. I'd read about his ruthless efficiency, his singular focus on national security at any cost. This wasn't just a clandestine surveillance operation, it was part of a larger, long-standing agenda. The Star People were ancient, wise, and peaceful, but they were not defenseless. They had simply chosen not to interfere directly. But if humanity, in its arrogance, tried to cage or weaponize their existence, the consequences could be catastrophic. I was faced with an impossible choice. I could flee, abandoning my research, abandoning the Star People, and disappearing into obscurity. But the thought of leaving them to the mercy of those who sought to exploit them was unbearable. Or I could try to fight, to expose what I knew, to somehow protect this ancient, hidden truth. But I was just one man, a historian, up against a secret government apparatus with seemingly limitless resources. During one particularly vivid dream, the Star People showed me a specific constellation, a complex, luminous cluster of stars I didn't recognize from any Earth-based astronomical chart. It was their home, or a representation of it. And within that vision, there was a sense of a specific time, a window of opportunity when the vortex would be at its peak power, allowing for a stronger, more direct connection, perhaps even a temporary passage. This wasn't just a vision of home, it was a veiled instruction, a hint at a solution. My resolve hardened. Fleeing was not an option. I had been called to Sedona, guided to this cabin, and given this knowledge for a reason. I was now a guardian of a truth far older than any human government. The listener pulsed warmly in my hand. The whispers in the cabin, once eerie, now felt like encouragement. I wasn't alone. The Star People were with me, and together we had to find a way. A plan, desperate and perhaps insane, began to form in my mind. I would not allow their silence to be broken by violence, nor their wisdom to be twisted into a weapon. I would use the very power of Sedona's vortex and the ancient knowledge entrusted to me to safeguard the secret of the Star People. With a new, terrifying clarity, my days became a frantic, methodical preparation. The Star People's message was clear. There was a specific window, a convergence of celestial and terrestrial energies, when the Sedona vortex would reach an unprecedented peak. During this brief period, the veil between dimensions would thin to its absolute minimum. This wasn't just an opportunity for stronger communication. It was an opportunity for them to make a profound, undeniable statement, and for me to help ensure it was a peaceful one. My task was twofold. First, to amplify the vortex's natural energies and stabilize the dimensional connection using Kaya's knowledge and the listener. Second, to protect that connection from the encroaching government presence. I spent hours studying Kaya's journal, cross-referencing her astronomical charts with my modern data. She had meticulously documented the cycles, the alignments, the subtle shifts in the Earth's magnetic field that preceded these convergences. It was an astronomical calendar, passed down through generations. The listener, the obsidian stone, became an extension of my own senses. When held, it hummed with the increasing power of the vortex. I used it to calibrate the various energy conduits around the cabin, ancient stone formations, oddly placed crystals, and even specific juniper trees, all of which Kaya had subtly documented as integral parts of the vortex's natural amplification system. I wasn't creating the energy, I was merely fine-tuning an ancient natural instrument. As I worked, faint, shimmering geometric patterns would sometimes appear in the air, visible only to me, guiding my hands. The government presence grew bolder. I no longer just saw SUVs at a distance. Drones, silent and black, would sometimes pass high above the canyon at night. On 2 occasions, I spotted figures moving stealthily through the underbrush, men in dark uniforms, their movements slow and deliberate, clearly mapping out the terrain, getting closer. The whispers from the Star People intensified, turning from warnings into tactical advice. They approach from the east. Their devices scan for high-frequency emissions, remain subtle. It was like having an invisible, benevolent army of guardians guiding my every move. My cabin, once a haven of quiet research, was now the epicenter of a standoff. I installed makeshift alarms, fishing lines strung with tin cans around the perimeter, crude but effective against stealthy approachers. I prepared an escape route should the worst happen, but deep down I knew escape wasn't the goal. The goal was to ensure the Star People's message was heard, unfiltered, and uncorrupted. The night of the convergence approached, marked by a rare lunar eclipse and a specific planetary alignment Kaya had detailed. The air around the cabin crackled with an almost tangible energy. The red rocks themselves seemed to hum. I could feel the vortex swirling, a powerful, unseen current rising from the earth. I knew they would come. Director Thorne's men would be here. But this time, they wouldn't be dealing with a lone historian. They would be dealing with an ancient force awakened and ready to speak. My heart pounded, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The moment of truth was almost upon us. The night arrived not with silence, but with a hum. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a deep, low-frequency vibration that emanated from the very heart of the earth. The air in the canyon crackled with energy. Overhead, the moon began its slow disappearance into the earth's shadow, and the stars blazed with a wild, preternatural brilliance. The convergence had begun. I stood in the center of the cabin, holding the listener in both hands. The stone was no longer just warm, it pulsed with a bright internal light, projecting shifting patterns onto the walls. Patterns like the ones I had seen in my dreams. The cabin no longer felt like a wooden structure. It had become the center of a resonance chamber, tuning itself to the symphony of the cosmos. As predicted, they came. I saw them through the window, more than a dozen dark figures in tactical gear moving silently along the perimeter. They didn't storm the cabin, they deployed equipment, strange, bulky devices aimed at my location, their casings humming with contained energy. They weren't here to arrest me, they were here to capture the power source. I closed my eyes and focused, pouring all of my will and intention into the listener. I didn't ask for protection or for an attack. I followed Kaya's instructions, serving my role as a conduit. I opened the channel, allowing the energy of the vortex to flow through me, through the stone, and outward. And then the world erupted in light. It wasn't an explosion, it was like a sunrise happening instantaneously everywhere at once. A massive dome of pure white light erupted from the ground, centered on my cabin. It expanded silently but with incredible force. As the wave of light washed over the agents, their equipment erupted in showers of sparks and died. They cried out, blinded, stumbling back from the radiance that didn't burn but was overwhelmingly bright. Inside the dome of light, there was only peace. The air became a living panorama. Stars, galaxies, and nebulae swirled around me. And then I saw them. They didn't appear, they simply became visible. Tall, elegant figures of light and energy, their forms barely defined, their eyes points of pure starlight. They stood among the red rocks, on the ground, in the air, dozens, hundreds of them. They were not looking at me or at the agents, they were looking at the world. They spoke no words, but their message cascaded across the planet, broadcast through every energy node, every ley line, every sensitive consciousness on Earth. It was not a warning, but a reminder, a vision of what Earth could be, healed, unified, at peace, a vision of what it was becoming, scarred, divided, on the brink of self-destruction. They didn't show technology or secrets, they showed us ourselves. I stood breathless in the center of a storm of light and truth, tears streaming down my face. I had fulfilled my purpose, but as the blinding light reached its crescendo, I felt a new, sudden presence, not from the star people, but from something else, something that had been drawn by this surge of energy, a dark, otherworldly shadow at the edge of my perception. The star people had come with a message, but it seemed their call had been heard by more than just humanity. The flash of light lasted only a few minutes, but it held an eternity. As the blinding radiance began to fade, the dark presence I had sensed retreated, as if startled not by the light's power, but by its sudden absence. The star people did not engage in a fight. They simply delivered their message and withdrew. Their luminous forms dissolved like smoke on the wind, merging back into the landscape, becoming invisible, but as I now knew, ever present. The last thing to fade was the cabin. The dome of light contracted, pulling back into the earth, into the vortex, until the final spark vanished into the listener in my hands. The stone grew cold and dark once more. And then came the silence. A profound, ringing silence, deeper than any I had known before. The alarms were dead, the wind was still, even the insects of the night had fallen quiet. In the sudden darkness, I could hear the panicked shouts of the agents. Disoriented, their equipment fried, they had faced a phenomenon they could neither explain nor record. Within minutes, they were in full retreat, carrying their useless devices with them. They had come for a weapon or a technology, and all they received was a blast of light and a deafening silence. They had no evidence, only a story that no one would ever believe. I was left alone, exhausted but at peace. As the first rays of the morning sun touched the tops of the red rocks, I knew that everything had changed. The vortex had settled, its energy returning to a soft, ambient hum. The star people had sent their message, but they had done so wisely. They didn't linger to be worshipped or studied. They knew that humanity had to find its own way. The blinding light was not the answer, but merely a reminder of the questions we needed to ask ourselves. I never left the cabin. My research transformed into something else, a vigil, a guardianship. I became the keeper of Kaya's legacy, another link in the chain of those who listened to the silence. The government watchers never returned in force, but I know they still watch from a distance, baffled and wary of a power they cannot control. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I sit outside, holding the listener, and I can feel the faintest echo, a soft whisper on the edge of hearing. It's no longer a warning, but a calm presence. The star people continue to watch and to wait, waiting for us to be ready, to hear their message not through blinding displays, but through the quiet wisdom in our own hearts. My job is not to shout the truth from the rocks, but simply to listen and to remember, to safeguard the knowledge for a day when we are ready. And here, in the heart of Sedona, among the ancient stones and the eternal stars, the wait doesn't seem so long.